Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tea with Julia. My guest today is Nicholas Cullinan, who took up his position as the director of the National Portrait Gallery in spring 2015 and is currently overseeing a £35.5 million transformation of the gallery with the architect Jamie Fobert. After this, curator of modern and contemporary art of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and from 2007 to 2013. Hi, Nick.
Hi, morning.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I'm just going to continue with your bio.
Sure.
So give me just 1 second. Nicholas was curator of international model art at Tate Modern, where in 2014 he co-curated an exhibition of Henri Matisse's cutouts with Sir Nicholas Serota. Nicholas Cullinan received his BA, MA and PhD in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, and 2006 and 2007 he held the Hilla Rebay International Fellowship at the Guggenheim Museums in Bilbao, New York and Venice. So here we are, and you're in the most august surroundings. I think it's the NPG library.
Yes, I'm in the library and archive, and you can see all of the shelves behind me. My house is not this organized.
It's fantastic. And is it only for use by people who work at the gallery or the museum, or can other people from outside come?
No, it's for the public. It's open, and anyone can research. This is essentially a sort of national record of biography. So you can come and research your ancestors and find out the iconography of key sitters. So
How
that's my
amazing.
plug. Yeah, it's a great resource.
It is a great resource. I can see I'm going to be coming. It's like, where's Julia? At the National Portrait Gallery Library. Fantastic.
Shall I go and look for the Peyton-Jones behind me?
Please, will you? Oh, it's so exciting. Now tell me, how are you? How's your family in these tumultuous times? You know, we've got COVID-19 still with us to a greater or lesser degree, and of course a very changing political landscape. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's been a tumultuous 4 months for all of us, and I think there's been so many changes. I think we've all been working harder than ever as well, but we're getting there, which is good. So, yeah.
Well,
How are you?
I'm very glad to hear it. Well, good. I've been back at work for a month, and I feel, you know, I feel that now people have sort of long service medals in a way, and I go by tube, and
That's brave.
Well, yes and no. I suppose I think if you're going to get this terrible disease, you can catch it from anybody and from anywhere. And, you know, it can be the postman with the letters or a delivery to wherever you're living. So I kind of like the idea of getting back to normal, really, and engaging with life. And also I have a fear that the lockdown might come back, and I don't want to feel that I've missed this chunk where we can all re-engage to a greater or lesser extent. So that's really my thinking.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I think we all have to get back to some semblance of normal, but obviously just being careful.
Exactly. So returning to you, you were awarded a BA, MA and PhD from the Courtauld. You're a scholar. How do you marry your penchant for scholarship with the administrative duties at the NPG? Where is the creativity for you in running the museum?
Well, I guess I marry it by doing interviews in the library and archive, so I look scholarly. It's a really good question. I mean, obviously, as director, your first responsibility isn't curating or scholarship. However, it's very much part of what you should be championing at the institution. So although I don't personally, as much now, have time to research or write, it's something that I think if you have that training and background, you understand the importance of it. And you can champion it for other people. So I think the two things marry pretty well. And I think what's nice about being a director and running a museum is that you get to support and champion everyone, whether it's the artists you're working with, the staff, the curators, all the different departments.
And so what would you count as the most important experience in your career to date? Is there a person or an event which has informed your thinking to make you the director you are today?
I would say probably it's been working with artists, and those relationships have been really kind of key to my thinking. You know, one obvious example is Cy Twombly, who I used to work with when I was still in my 20s. I was so lucky, and that had a big impact on me. I mean, to be able to see a great artist still at the peak of their career. Si was then in his late 70s and early 80s, but to be able to spend time with them in the studio, to talk to them, and that, I mean, even that relationship with Si generated so many other ideas and projects, whether it was the Matisse Cutouts exhibition, which came from talking to him about Matisse's late period and being in the studio with him and realizing what it must have been like, being curious what it would have been like to visit Matisse in his studio in Nice in the late 50s. Or, you know, other ideas, the Twombly-Poussin show, the Unfinished show at the Met, they kind of all came from Si. So, like the relationships I have with artists are really crucial, and they often generate other things in surprising ways that you wouldn't think about.
Well, indeed, when we will come on to it a little later, but, you know, the Contemporary has been very much a part of the National Portrait Gallery's exhibition programme under your direction. Not that it wasn't with Sandy's, but I've become more aware of it. And so the role of the NPG in the UK and internationally, does the museum occupy a position unlike any other, at least in the UK? I always think it does, but I'd like to know how you see it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and that's one of the reasons that drew me to this role. And obviously, I worked at the NPG when I was a student at the Courtauld. I worked here part-time as a visitor service assistant, essentially, you know, guarding the galleries, which was a really enjoyable part-time job. But it was just a gig to pay the rent. You know, I would finish at the library in the Courtaulds, come down the Strands, put my uniform on, and then spend a few hours in the galleries.
But looking at art, that's the key thing. I never did that as when I was a student. But the thing about being a gallery assistant is that you are in a parallel position of being in one place, and you can look at art for hours, and that's your job.
Yeah, I mean, it was wonderful just to spend hours in the galleries and to be able to study the paintings, but also obviously art, but refreshing my knowledge of British history as well. That was 20 years ago. So what attracted me about this role was the chance to really think about how to reinvent the gallery, but not by changing its DNA, very much focusing on what it does that's unique. And obviously what's unique about the NPG is the focus on biography, history, and that relationship between artist and sitter. And that's quite unique. I mean, even the fact that when you see the labels in the galleries, we always begin with the sitter first and then the artist. That's a unique way of labeling works of art. So I wouldn't want to try and swerve away from that. I think what you have to do is make the most of what's unique about what you're doing and then amplify it. Because
the museum, your museum, is in this very interesting position where one of your colleagues in another institution can have done an exhibition of an artist's work quite recently, but you can focus in on an aspect of it, which means that there's a sort of, the public get a double whammy, so to speak. And this is a really, you can look at work in depth, obviously from the perspective of portraiture, from representing the figure, the body, the human being.
Yeah, and that's what's been really interesting working with living artists and inviting them into the institution when we make an exhibition, whether it's with Elizabeth Peyton or Cindy Sherman or Tass Tadine, just to give 3 recent examples. It's to really work with the artist and think about how their work has a specific resonance in this historic collection. And in terms of portraiture and history and biography and all of these things. So what we don't tend to do is just do the kind of usual show that could be anywhere in another gallery. We try and do something that's quite specific and unique to our context and our remit. And that's when you get something really interesting and quite special.
Yes, exactly. That's my experience.
Yeah.
And so in the many competing priorities you have at the National Portrait Gallery, what for you is the most significant?
Well, I suppose the big thing, the biggest thing is the capital project, the refurbishment, which will be the biggest refurbishment the gallery's had, the biggest change since the building opened in 1896. So that's quite a big one. And that's obviously been occupying a lot of my time the last 5 years, whether it's just fundraising, raising the 35.5 million, appointing the wonderful architect, Jamie Fobert, shaping the plans, working with the curators on the rehang of the collection, because it's not just a capital project about bricks and mortar and a building. It's really to showcase the collection and to focus on that. So that's a pretty big one. But to be honest, every day is different. Every day, you're dealing with lots of different things, whether it's the finances, staff, HR, the program, commissioning, and I enjoy that variety.
And so, of the shows under your tenure at the MPG, or indeed before you joined the MPG, which are the ones you're most proud of?
Again, it's probably the ones that are unique or different in some way. I mean, for example, the Matisse cutout show that was at Tate in 2014 is a highlight. It was a beautiful show. It was a real feat to get those cutouts together. It took sort of 5 years to do that show. But the shows, for me personally, that are the most memorable are the ones that are quite unique. I mean, for example, I would say the Twombly-Poussin show that I did at Dulwich Picture Gallery back in 2011, which paired Cy Twombly with Poussin, which is not an obvious juxtaposition. But
and he died by that time. He was no longer alive, or did he see it?
Cy died, I think, 3 or 4 days after the show opened, sadly.
Really?
Yeah, so he never got to see it. I mean, I was speaking to him from the installation. I didn't know that he was dying. But it was very moving, and I mean, Cy was very curious about that show because it was such a sort of different show, and to see the works in dialogue, it really shouldn't have worked. It was quite a risky show to do. I think I enjoy doing those shows, but I have to say, for me personally, that's probably the show I'm proudest of because I think it did something quite unique. But other people might disagree. I don't know. It's not for me to blow my own trumpet, but that's the one I think about.
It's interesting because projects, as you've described so well, there's a personal kind of history and engagement with them. I think back over my curatorial career, and each project has its own challenges and which are private between you and the team, between you and the artist overcoming problems. And that's a kind of, and I always think that you're forever a band when you see that person 20 years from now. And you worked on a project, it's like, oh my God, you're like brother and sister, and it's an incredible bond. And then there's the relationship of how the project then engages with the public, how it's received, sometimes much better than you think, sometimes things can be, the response can be disappointing. But it's an incredible experience to go through that. And that show was an amazing one. I remember it well, and it was hugely impressive. And what I want to do now is to bring up some images of the National Portrait Gallery, the outside, which I hope everybody knows incredibly well because they're visitors to the museum, they come to see you often. But I think this is going to be your new entrance, is that right?
Yes, so this is a visual. This is not the outside as it is now. This is a visual of how it will look when we reopen in 2023. And here you see the north facade of the gallery, which in a way is the main facade of the building. The current entrance, which is just around the corner, is more akin now for modern museums to a kind of side entrance. Obviously the building was built in 1896. And when we appointed Jamie Fobert, the architect, who's fantastic, he presented this idea in his interview. And it's a very simple idea, but he said essentially what the MPG doesn't have is a public presence. It doesn't have public realm or a public forecourt. And so the idea here is to really open up the building by turning 3 windows, which you see, I can't point, but I'm sure people can make it out perfectly well.
I think, I can point, but I don't think people can see it. But anyway, there's light coming from them. So I think that's a good, if I've interpreted you correctly, yeah.
And it's to open up the building and to make it much more welcoming, because as Jamie said, currently it's a public gallery that currently, for various reasons, because of windows being shut, etc., looks more like a private club. And so we really want to open it up and to make people feel welcome, and that this is a place that belongs to them.
And also, I suppose, as an opportunity to install work in the little plaza in front of the gallery, which also is another opportunity, a place for people to gather, a mini forecourt like the Pompidou Centre in Paris, maybe,
I mean, all these debates over public sculpture and statues, it's so interesting. So there's endless potential there.
Endless potential. But also you've got the plinth, in Trafalgar Square, bang next door to you, which of course has a changing installation every year. So there are many models that you can adopt or not as the museum sees fit.
Yeah.
And then the next, sorry. Please.
No, I was going to say, we're talking to a couple of artists now about adding not a statue, but some kind of sculptural intervention or presence to that new forecourt, but we'll see.
Exciting.
So watch this space.
Yes, closely. Now, this is an amazing picture of the museum as it used to be. What period is this? When was this taken?
So this is really fascinating and I think quite exciting. We found this in the archive, this archive actually, right behind me, recently. This is the Devine wing of the National Portrait Gallery when it opened in 1933. And so you see the original hang. This is currently where our Regency paintings, this wing, these galleries are hung. And those of you that know the gallery will know that they're hung on a sort of turquoise silk. But if you look very closely at the photo here, you can see that originally, when the Devine wing opened in 1933, the paintings were hung on bare wooden boards.
Yeah, amazing. Extraordinary.
So we're going to uncover those in the autumn. And one idea is, will they be in good enough condition and perhaps interesting enough to then hang on, which I've never seen done before. So this feels very exciting.
Very exciting, and also kind of appropriate given the sort of, because so much of the National Portrait Gallery, it's one of my questions, is about, you know, what makes a good portrait? What is the role of portraiture now? And what is the difference between a painted portrait or capturing an image with a camera? And that, I mean, those sort of questions, amongst many, many others, is what the museum is dealing with.
Yeah.
And to place it in such a historical context would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, the projects, the capital projects with the building is really to make, it's actually a very beautiful building. And I think sometimes you don't notice that because of the fact that some galleries haven't been touched for 30 years. They've been changed over the years. And what we really want to do is to bring back the integrity of the whole building. And so that's, for me, a very exciting project, is not just to build a new wing or add something onto what's there, but to make the most of what you have already. And then to use that to really show off the collection and to animate it in different ways.
Yes. And also, thankfully, you're not dealing with a white cube.
No,
because,
no.
you know, I always think about, you know, new museums, you know, some museums have better doorknobs than others because they, you know, they have a bigger budget, but basically it's a kind of mix and match of what's already known, whereas you have an altogether more interesting challenge and also a way of creating a different kind of context for both the historical works but also the contemporary works that you may show.
Exactly, yeah. And what we want to do is, again, create something quite specific. And so one of the reasons that this particular hang appeals is I've never seen this done before. I've never seen paintings. And you can imagine these are, again, the Regency paintings, which have these very rich reds and crimsons with gilt frames hung on bare wooden polished boards would be very beautiful.
Beautiful.
So we'll see.
Beautiful. Now,
but we might uncover the boards and they might be a terrible mess, so I can't promise anything yet, but we'll see.
Well, maybe you can have a little corner which is exposed and saying, well, we could have done this, but we decided against it.
We'll see, yeah. We'll know more soon.
Now, this gentleman, please tell us more about him. Is this the oldest portrait in the collection?
So this is the so-called Chandos portrait, which is a portrait of William Shakespeare. And it's NPG #1. So this was the founding painting that was given to establish the collection in 1856. So this is very important because it's the first painting to enter the collection. That it was deliberately given to establish the collection because obviously Shakespeare is kind of important.
Main man.
Exactly. But this also has really interesting issues around it. So one of the reasons this is so important is this is still reputed to be the only true likeness of Shakespeare. It's the only work which we're pretty sure was painted in his lifetime and probably from life, or from the life is the phrase that we use. And this is one of the kind of crucial tenets of the MPG, that we always collect beginning with the sitter, not the artist. Obviously the artist is crucial. And the marriage between artist and sitter is very interesting. We can talk about that. But we always begin with the sitter. And then in terms of historic portraits, the tendency has always been to try and find images that were painted from life, not just copies of copies. So this, in a way, establishes some of our key parameters still to this day, although obviously we're thinking through those as mediums and practice evolves.
Yes.
But this is kind of important.
No, of course. I mean, absolutely key. And then this is another example, which I think of the miniature, the Hilliard miniature exhibition that was, what, 18 months ago, something like that?
Yep, early 2019. Pre-corona, which just already feels like a lifetime ago. So
Yes.
I have to say, this is one of the exhibitions that I've been the proudest of during my time here the last 5 years. So this was an exhibition for Nicholas Hilliard and Isaac Oliver, two of the great miniaturists in British art. And it was a beautiful show. You can see it was very jewel-like, the way we installed it. And one of the reasons I was very proud of this is that when I began 5 years ago, I remember saying, what about an exhibition of Hilliard? Because there hasn't been one since the early 1980s. And obviously, you know, Hilliard and Oliver, they're some of the great gems, no pun intended, of British art, and quite unique. And I remember being told, well, the problem is if you show miniatures, no one's interested, no one comes. People don't care about them these days. And what we did was do a huge amount of work on how best to show them. Obviously, the scholarship around them too. Catherine MacLeod, the curator, is a real expert in this field. And I think one thing that's very interesting is when we were talking about this, I said, but I think people now are very comfortable looking at faces this big, and as we're doing now on a screen. If you think when we grew up, you know, we were used to either the sort of cinema scale or the television scale, and now that's gone down to become... Yes. And we're used to holding things in our hands and looking at faces and images which are quite diminutive. It's the same scale as miniatures. And what was really interesting is the exhibition did, you know, very well. It had very good reviews and it had very good attendance. And of course it had attendance from our existing audience, but it also brought in a new audience of younger people who were very curious to see these for the first time, as was I.
Yes. Well, they were ravishing images, absolutely unbelievably beautiful, and so finely painted. I mean, I think the thing about a miniature is that you think of its smallness, but the sheer beauty of them was a real surprise, and I was really delighted to see them. It was unexpected and joyous, actually.
Well, I can tell you this is very exciting that when we reopen in 2023, for the first time ever, we're going to have a gallery dedicated to miniatures spanning 5 centuries. Wow. So it will go from the Tudor period, and if you saw the Tacita Dean exhibition we did a couple of years ago, obviously Tacita is a great filmmaker, and she wanted to make, especially for us, the first ever miniature film. And I was on the phone to Tacita yesterday, and we're planning to find a way to install that alongside the miniatures.
Wow, so how exciting.
It will be miniatures from sort of 1520 to 2018.
Excellent. So the idea of the postage stamp still lives.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, here's another wonderful image of the historical and contemporary. Could you just tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, so this is from Elizabeth Peyton's exhibition, which we did late last year, that ran until January, and is actually opening in China at UCCA in the middle of August. So just to give that exhibition
congratulations.
Which is great, yeah. Who could have thought a few months ago that the exhibition would be traveling to China? It's fantastic. Yeah. So Elizabeth's show, and again, this goes back to what I was talking about before, the way that we work with artists. And we always try and create something quite specific and unique for them and the context of their work, but also for the gallery. And when we began planning Elizabeth's show years ago, obviously Elizabeth Peyton is one of the great contemporary artists, painters and portraitists. Although, again, she doesn't really think of herself as a portraitist, which is why this show was quite interesting for her. When we began planning it, the idea was to have it as the kind of usual standalone temporary exhibition, which would be in its own separate galleries. And then when we were talking about it, because her works are quite, again, diminutive and small scale, we realized how beautiful it could be to have the standalone exhibition, which happened on the ground floor, but then to take her works and just to intersperse them quietly throughout the historic galleries. And so you see here, this was in the Tudor Gallery, and obviously you have one of our great images of Elizabeth I on the left-hand side, and then next to it, Elizabeth's painting of Kurt Cobain from 1995, I believe. And these two things just seem to sit together quite beautifully in the space.
And what is it particularly that makes it, for you, that connection so real and so important?
In this specific example, or in general?
Yes, in this specific example.
Well, I mean, kind of like everything I do, it's intuition. I remember just seeing the Kurt painting and saying he belongs in the Tudor Gallery. Yeah. And when we hung it, it was absolutely right. And these two things sit together very happily. So, you know, everything I do is kind of based on intuition. I never try to sort of second guess or focus group. You just have to do what you believe in and see if it works, and hopefully see if other people also, you know, find it interesting.
One of the things that really fascinated me about your show of Elizabeth Peyton's work was what an incredible colorist she is.
Yeah.
I think that really came through, and for me, in a way that it wasn't that I hadn't appreciated it before, but particularly in the context of the MPG. Yeah. And there's something about that resonance, particularly in the museum setting, that makes them very vivid from both perspectives, both the historical perspective and also the contemporary perspective.
Yeah, you see here, even just formally, this works because of the sort of dark backgrounds, the jewel-like colors, even the red hair. And so it's a juxtaposition which feels quite natural and hopefully not forced. And
also the sort of texture, the richness of Kurt Cobain's clothing. I mean, you know, we can't see it in detail, unfortunately, in this image, but, you know, it could be velvet. I want it to be velvet, even if it isn't. You know, it's that kind of lusciousness of material, which is just extraordinary.
But again, sort of every exhibition I do, I really try to make it quite unique and to do something different, and also to be the absolute best version of that exhibition it can be. So with Elizabeth's show, in order to even achieve that, to be able to have the works all over the museum, we had to make it free, because you can't obviously pay, you know, you can't charge a ticket for the permanent collection. And so that required a huge amount of fundraising that we had to do. But it was worth it to be able to create this kind of beautiful sort of open exhibition that wasn't confined to one or two rooms.
Yes. And of course, one of the things is about attendance, which is so, you know, is such a factor in all museums and galleries thinking.
Yeah.
Because they, you know, it does matter. It matters for box office, but it also matters for the kind of relevance of the institution at any one time. You know, if people are coming, it justifies the public subsidy and so on.
Yeah.
But for you, is attendance important? Do you care if people come to the museum, or do you care if shows are, you know, well covered in the press? Is it important?
Yeah, no, I mean, of course I care, and you have to care because you're also running a business and you have to make sure that everything adds up. But I never just care about the quantity of, you know, how many people or how many articles. It's also about who is coming.
Yes.
And so the thing that I always look at is, obviously you always have targets of, you know, attendance that you need to achieve or try to achieve. But the thing that we're constantly doing too is trying to also broaden out the audience, and not just say more and more people, but increasingly a greater diversity of people. And that's very important too. So it's both things together.
Yeah. Now tell us about this portrait.
This is one of our latest commissions and additions to the collection. And this again speaks to that relationship between artist and sitter I was referring to before. And one of the things that's really unique about the MPG is that we're the only museum that actively commissions for the collection. So every year the trustees meet and decide a group of individuals who, from different walks of life, whether it's, you know, charity or science or industry or literature, who they feel have made a contribution and deserve to be in the collection. And then it's my happy job, working with the curators, to find the right artist to make that portrait. So this is a portrait we only unveiled, I think, last week, and it's of the writer Zadie Smith, by the artist Toyin Oje-Odutola, who's a fantastic, still quite young artist. She's 35, I think, as of last week. Yes. And we just unveiled this on social media last week, and it will go to Brent, the borough in London, which is the Borough of Culture, this year in December, and be seen for the first time. But Zadie was definitely on the list of sitters to be commissioned to have a portrait made. And then the idea was to pair her with Toyin, and it worked, I have to say, beautifully. I mean, not just in terms of the final results, but they had a very, very interesting and warm relationship. There's a very good interview between the two of them on our website.
Yes, indeed, I read it, and it's really excellent. And also, Zadie's very sympathetic to the visual arts. I mean, she's, you know, not everybody's visual, but she seems very connected, and it's always inspiring to see two people from different creative disciplines engaging in a kind of in each other's work, really.
Well, you never know if it's going to work. It's like matchmaking.
Yes,
and usually it does. But when it works exceptionally well, as is the case here, then that's a really wonderful thing to make happen.
Well, congratulations. Really exciting. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you about is the role of portraiture and the role of portraiture now. What makes a good portrait? And what's the difference between a painted portrait or capturing the image with a camera, for example?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So obviously the gallery, you know, when you come to the gallery, the main thing you see are paintings. We have about 12,000 paintings in the collections, going from the Tudor period all the way through to now. And of course, contemporary painting carries on, as we've already seen from Toyin and Elizabeth and other artists. The other thing we have, and this is what's sort of in the boxes behind me, is one of the great photography collections in the world. So we have 250,000 photographs, whether it's amazing, and we don't get to show this nearly as much. You know, whether it's Cecil Beaton or Julia Margaret Cameron, or sort of other more vernacular images. So that's a huge part of the collection. The other thing I've been very keen to do while I've been here is to diversify the mediums that we show and commission, which explains Tacita, Dean, for example. Yeah. That was the first exhibition we'd ever done looking at film. And obviously, you know, in the contemporary era, we look at portraits of all shapes and sizes and all different forms, whether it's through social media, digitally, whether it's film, whether it's painted. And I think we need to really reflect that diversity of image making in our collection and in our exhibition program.
And also, Tacita's exhibition was a collaboration with the National Portrait Gallery. The National Gallery,
yeah.
And also the Royal Academy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that was similar to Elizabeth's show, where I like to always try and invent a different structure. So with Elizabeth's show, in order to make it as beautiful as it could be, we had to disperse it through the museum and therefore make it free. So you have to kind of invent these models. With Tacita's show, Tacita I've known and worked with for many years. We did the Turbine Hall commission at Tate back in 2011. And when I got the job here 5 years ago, along with Elizabeth, she was one of the artists I reached out to and said, right, we've got to do a show. You know, we've got to do a show of your work and looking at film. And then a few months into that conversation, she said to me, oh, the Royal Academy have asked me to do a show as well. And I suppose I have to say no, because, you know, there can only be one show. And I said, actually, no, we could collaborate, because the MPG is so unique and specific. Yeah. There's room to do something. And then we were going to focus on portraiture and her films and her photographs that relate to portraiture or are portraits. And then the idea was to have the Royal Academy look at landscape, which is another genre that her films and her work, whether it's the blackboards, covers. And then I realized we were missing a genre, which is obviously still life. So I called Gabriele next door at the National Gallery and said, would you join? And the three of us.
Fantastic.
But, you know, the more the merrier. And rather than have the usual model of saying, well, you can only do the show with us and you can't do anything else, what we actually did was to do this unprecedented collaboration across 3 institutions. But it had a perfectly sensible structure, which was looking at different mediums: still life, landscape, portraiture. So again, I think you have to kind of invent rather than, we have to collaborate more rather than compete.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is the time of collaboration.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I wanted to return now to Cy Twombly, an artist that you knew extremely well, and I also worked with. We did a show of his works on paper at the Serpentine from his collection. And I remember that he said to me, he asked me whether I'd noticed that all expensive paintings were brown paintings. And I can't mimic or do his accent, but it was this incredible drawl, and it was incredible to listen to. And then NPG is full of brown paintings. So and also it's, you know, this is a museum where you know what the subject matter is going to be. And what is the portrait in the museum that you most admire and why? And is there a portrait that haunts you?
Yes, there is.
Good.
It's a brown portrait, so I would have been very happy. Actually, it's funny, and there's a real overlap with Cy. So we actually, you know, we did a little display around Cy Twombly and Portraiture late last year.
Yes, I do actually. I should have mentioned it. Yeah.
With drawings and unseen drawings and photographs and a painting. So the painting for me that's my personal favourite, and it's just for very personal reasons, is George Romney's self-portrait from 1784, which is the unfinished self-portrait.
Yes.
And the reason I love that so much is that when I worked at the MPG first time around as a guard, basically, and this must have been 2002, we had a Romney show. And I spent hours and hours in the Romney show. So I now have a real love and appreciation of Romney, which has stayed with me. But that unfinished painting, Cy, when I was working with him, when we first met, this is around 2007, talked to me about how much he loved unfinished works in general. Because you get to, the work isn't closed in time, it's not fixed. You get to see inside the process, whether it was being made with a sort of continuous tense 500 years ago or yesterday. And that gave me the idea for the unfinished exhibition, which we eventually did at the Met. This was about 4 years ago. And indeed, the Romney unfinished self-portrait was in that exhibition. So all these things link.
How marvellous, the umbilical cord.
Yes.
For people who maybe don't know the painting as well as you do, from my memory, it has great sways of unpainted canvas without any ground on it. Yep. So I would say that the painted image doesn't take up more than 50% of the canvas. And there's something about those possibilities, as you've described so well, that makes it incredible. But it also makes it extraordinarily contemporary.
Exactly. It looks like a painting. It doesn't look like an 18th century painting because it's unfinished. So you have this real focus on his face and his gaze, which is confronting you quite sharply and directly.
Yes.
And then this swathe of unfinished sort of bare canvas around it. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, unfinished works, I think, fascinated Cy, and now certainly me, is that they're not fixed in time. And you can put a painting made 500 years ago next to one unfinished yesterday or unfinished today, and they actually can look equivalent. Yes,
it's fascinating. So without wanting to tempt fate, what would be your idea of the worst nightmare at the National Portrait Gallery? In these times of COVID-19, a pertinent question.
I sort of hesitate from saying this, and I'm going to knock on wood when I do. But obviously, the basic thing is the reason we're all here is to look after and safeguard the collection for all of us today and really for future generations. So the worst thing that could ever happen would be some terrible fire, and I'm knocking on wood as I say that.
Yes, and I am too, Ed.
Because the number one thing you're here to do is to look after the gallery, to look after the collection, and to pass it on to future generations. You're a custodian, a temporary custodian.
Yes. And actually, this brings me very neatly to my last question, because sadly, we're going to have to go soon. What do you consider is the greatest challenge for museums now? And what do you consider will be the greatest challenge for museums in, let's say, 10 years' time? How will you ensure that the MPG remains relevant in these days when the public's increasing engagement with technology means that they're all taking, portraits, their own portraits, portraits of other people? And also, is the museum's BP Portrait Award still relevant?
So that's a really good question. It's something we're thinking about a lot, as I'm sure all museums are, especially in the last few months, the shifting landscape from COVID and how you navigate a museum literally with social distancing. And obviously, even before COVID, there was this question about the digital, and will people still want to come to museums when they can look at things on their phone or on a screen? And I think people will. I think that encounter with an object is very important still, and people search that out. And perhaps we want it even more when everything we look at is digital and is virtual. We sort of want to see people in real life. We want to encounter things. I think those two things will have to and can coexist. And that, I think, will be the future of museums. And certainly for the redisplay of the collection, we're doing a huge amount of work in terms of interpretation and how that could be brought in also digitally. But I think what we don't want to do is have VR headsets everywhere, especially because they're unhygienic now. No one wants to put them on. Or, to have big screens around the paintings. I think we want to let people, if they want, we want to give people choice. So you should have the painting, beautifully lit, beautifully displayed. And then if you choose to bring in other information from, augmented reality on your screen, you can do so. And I think that marriage of the object and the encounter and then the digital will be the future. I hope. I'm always optimistic.
Well, yes. And actually, it's incredibly exciting to think and plan.
Yeah.
And then the BP Portrait Award, that's going ahead in the future. And you've worked with them now. How long is it?
Oh, many, many years. I mean, obviously, we're closed now for the next, until 2023.
Of course, yes.
So, we're on a pause. And then, I mean, we've done competitions for many years, including for photography. So the Taylor Wessing Photographic Portrait Prize also does very well. We've just done this, we're in the midst of doing this fantastic initiative called Hold Still, which our patron, the Duchess of Cambridge, spearheaded, where we got the public to send in images. It was an open call of their experience of, the last few months in lockdown. And we got 31,000 entries.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So I just finished the judging this week over Zoom, which was interesting. So I think part of the MPG's program will always be to think about how we make portraiture relevant in different mediums. Yes. And that will definitely carry on into the future. And the competitions do that very well.
And that's why, all of us follow your work and the museum's incredible program. And Nick, thank you so very, very, very much for being so generous and with all your answers and also telling us so much about the museum. Every good luck with your worst nightmares. My catastrophic question never happens, obviously. And the best of luck with finally finalising the fundraising. And I really look forward to your new projects as they unfold. Thank you for joining me today. No, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Great. So to end this today's conversation, I just want to tell you about the work that Gallery Thaddeus Ropac is doing. In our gallery in the Marais in Paris, we have an exhibition of new work by Jules de Palincourt called There Are More Eyes Than Leaves on the Trees. Also on display is Mark Brandenburg's Snowflake. Dimensions of Reality, Female Minimal is on view at our Paris gallery in Pantin until next week. Pieces from galleries artists, and Anselm Kiefer's exhibition will open in our Salzburg gallery next week. Next Saturday at 11 a.m, I will be having tea with Tim Marlowe, who is Chief Executive and Director of the Design Museum in London, formerly Artistic Director of the Royal Academy of Arts and Director of Exhibitions at White Q. He has been involved in contemporary art for the last 30 years as a curator, writer and broadcaster, working with many of the most important and influential artists of our time. He has delivered wide-ranging and popular programs and brings a commitment to diverse and engaging exhibitions to his new role, showcasing the transformational capability of design. He sits on the board of trustees for the Imperial War Museum, Sadler's Wells, Art on the Underground Advisory Board, and Culture Shock Media. He was awarded an OBE in 2019. Thank you so much for joining me, and I do hope I'll see you next Saturday at 11 o'clock. Goodbye.